On the morning of January 28th, 2017, 20-year-old Elaine Park vanished without a trace. Hours earlier, she had been at her ex-boyfriend's home in Calabasas, California, where security cameras captured her walking to her car and driving away just after dawn. 5 days later, Elaine's charcoal gray Honda Civic was discovered abandoned along the Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu. The doors were unlocked, the battery was dead with the lights left on, and her personal belongings were still inside, and Elaine herself was nowhere to be found. In the years since that day, her case has become a haunting mystery, leaving family, friends, and investigators desperate for answers. Elaine Park was the only child of a Korean-American family, and she was known for her upbeat personality and love of the arts and acting. In high school, Elaine had been a cheerleader and performer in musical theater, and she aspired to an entertainment career. She even landed small roles as an extra on popular TV shows, including Desperate Housewives and Mad TV. In 2017, Elaine was living with her mother, Susan Park, while attending a local college. She had recently taken a break from school and was going through a rough patch. She'd dropped out of some courses and lost a restaurant job, which had been discouraging. Elaine also struggled at times with depression, but those close to her say she always kept in touch, and her disappearance was completely out of character. At the time of her disappearance, Elaine was in an on-and-off relationship with Divine Compeer, known as Div, the son of a prominent Hollywood businessman. Divine's father is the co-owner of a film production company, and he lived with his family in a gated hillside home in Calabasas. Elaine and Div had been dating casually, and although they'd broken up before, they continued spending time together. On the night of January 27th, 2017, Elaine made plans to hang out with Divine, not knowing it would be the last night anyone would see her. That evening, the young couple went to see a late movie at a theater in Woodland Hills. According to security footage and later interviews, they took an Uber to the movie around 10:20 p.m. and returned to Div's family home shortly after 1 a.m. The rideshare driver noted nothing unusual. Elaine and Divine seemed to be in good spirits and enjoyed their night out. What happened in the early morning hours of January 28th remains one of the most puzzling pieces of this case. Div told police that around 4 that morning, Elaine suddenly woke up, shaking and singing, appearing to suffer a panic attack for unknown reasons. He said he tried to comfort her and suggested she stay, but Elaine was restless and decided to leave. By about 6:05 a.m., Elaine had gotten dressed, walked out to her car, as captured on a home surveillance camera, and drove away from the residence. The gated community security system recorded her Honda Civic's license plate as it exited the neighborhood at 6:07 a.m. This was the last confirmed sighting of Elaine Park, driving off alone into the early morning dawn. When Elaine didn't return home later on January 28th and failed to answer her phone, her family grew concerned. Susan Park, Elaine's mother, tried calling and texting her repeatedly that day, but got no response. By the next day, January 29th, worry had set in among Elaine's loved ones. Susan contacted police to report her daughter missing, but initially police suggested Elaine might have just taken some time away since she was an adult. On Monday, January 30th, 2017, with still no sign of her daughter, Susan Park officially filed a missing person report. The case took a dramatic turn on February 2nd, 2017, when Elaine's car was found under strange circumstances. Investigators had been attempting to trace Elaine's movements through her cell phone signals. A ping from her phone indicated its last known location was near Malibu, California, along the Pacific Coast. Acting on this lead, Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies searched the area and discovered Elaine's 2015 Honda Civic parked on the shoulder of the Pacific Coast Highway. This was a beachside area about 20 miles from Div's home. The condition of the car raised immediate red flags. It was found in the middle of the day, yet the headlights were still switched on and the battery had died. The doors were unlocked and the keys were in the ignition, in the on position. But there was no sign of Elaine. Inside the vehicle, police found her personal items neatly left behind. Her cell phone, her backpack with a laptop, her ID and credit cards, cash, and a makeup bag were all sitting in the car. Nothing obvious was missing from the car, and there were no signs of struggle. Finding Elaine's car shifted the investigation into high gear. Initially, authorities treated Elaine as a possible voluntary missing adult, but after the car turned up, they reclassified her case as an involuntary missing person, indicating possible foul play. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and Glendale Police Department launched extensive searches around the area where the car was found. Search teams scoured the beach, nearby trails, and the rugged Santa Monica Mountains for any trace of Elaine. Cadaver dogs were brought in and combed the coastline and cliffs near where her vehicle was found, and divers searched the waters off Malibu's shore. Despite these efforts, no trace of Elaine was found on land or in the sea. After several days, the active search was scaled back, and investigators faced a frustrating lack of clues. Elaine had disappeared without a trace, and the trail had gone cold. Detectives interviewed everyone who had seen Elaine in her final days. Div Compier, the boyfriend who was the last known person to see Elaine, cooperated fully with police. He maintained that he had no idea what happened to her after she drove away. By March 2017, after reviewing the evidence and Div's alibi, Glendale police publicly stated that Divine Compier was not a suspect in Elaine's disappearance. With no definitive answers, numerous theories have emerged about what could have happened to Elaine Park. Importantly, all the theories I'm about to present are highly speculative, given the limited evidence available in this case. One theory is that Elaine may have died by her own hand near where her car was found. Those who support this idea point to her history of depression and the car's location by the ocean. It's conceivable that Elaine could have walked into the sea or hiked into the mountains intending to end herself. However, her family emphasizes that Elaine had never expressed these thoughts and had even made plans for the near future. Another theory suggests that she left to start a new life. However, running contrary to this theory is the fact that she left all her worldly possessions behind, which would have helped her in her apparent new life. The authorities consider this theory to be unlikely. Another possibility is that Elaine experienced some kind of accident after leaving her car. If she was in a disoriented or panicked state, she might have wandered off into the unfamiliar terrain of Malibu's canyons. The canyon area surrounding where her vehicle was found has steep cliffs, dense brush, and ocean currents nearby. It's conceivable she could have fallen into a ravine or been swept out to sea. But again, search teams, including bloodhounds and helicopters, found no evidence of an accident in the vicinity. This theory also struggles to explain why she would stop and exit her car with the keys left in it. Some have speculated that perhaps Elaine pulled over due to a medical episode, like a panic attack recurrence or even a substance reaction, and became lost or injured while seeking help. However, without any clues recovered, an accidental demise remains possible, but unconfirmed. Many consider it likely that Elaine met with foul play after leaving the Compier house. One scenario is that she was followed or abducted by an unknown predator on her way home. If someone with ill intent approached Elaine's car in Malibu, they might have coerced her out of the vehicle. The fact that her wallet, cash, and valuables were left untouched in the car suggests that robbery was not a motive. Instead, it could point to an abductor staging the scene to look like a voluntary disappearance. The location where the car was found, a pull-off by a beach, could have been chosen by a perpetrator who knew the area. Some have even raised the idea of a human trafficking situation or a random opportunistic crime. Others have speculated that she may have been involved in a substance deal gone wrong, which ended with a dealer slaying her. As discussed, Elaine was known to have difficulties with substances in the years leading up to her disappearance. At present, the true nature of Elaine Park's disappearance remains unknown, with more than 8 years having passed since her vanishing. Her case remains open and active, and she is officially classified as an endangered missing person. If she is still alive today, she would now be in her late 20s. In the mid-1970s, an elusive serial perpetrator terrorized San Francisco's gay community, preying on men he met in night spots and earning the nickname the Doodler. Between early 1974 and late 1975, at least 5 men were brutally slain, and several others assaulted, by an unidentified assailant who would sketch his targets before attacking. The Doodler's known crime spree spanned roughly 18 months. The first victim was discovered in the early hours of January 27, 1974, when the body of 50-year-old Gerald Earl Kavanaugh was found on Ocean Beach in San Francisco. Kavanaugh had been stabbed multiple times and showed defensive wounds. His slaying initially drew very little public attention. A few months later, on June 25, 1974, the perpetrator struck again. Joseph Stevens was found deceased near Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park. Stevens had been seen at a club the night before, and police believed he left with the suspect and was slain shortly afterward. The violence continued into the summer of 1974, as panic set in across the city and in the targeted community. On July 7, 1974, the body of Klaus Christmann, a 31-year-old German immigrant, was discovered at Ocean Beach. Christmann was married and had children, and the authorities thought he might have been closeted given the era's social climate. By this point, investigators began to suspect a pattern. The similar modus operandi and victim profile prompted police to link the cases. After a brief lull in the latter half of 1974, the perpetrator struck several more times in 1975. On April 27, 1975, 52-year-old Warren Andrews, a lawyer, was assaulted at Land's End, a coastal park not far from the prior Ocean Beach crime scenes. Andrews was bludgeoned with a rock and branch rather than stabbed, and he never regained consciousness, dying weeks later from his injuries. Notably, Warren Andrews was only connected to the Doodler by the authorities in 2022. This recent revelation suggests that there may be even more crimes linked to the Doodler than are publicly known. Just 2 weeks after the Andrews attack, on May 12, 1975, the body of Frederick Elmer Capon, 32, was found on Ocean Beach. Like the others, Capon had been stabbed in the torso, and evidence at the scene suggested his body had been dragged roughly 20 feet, indicating an attempt to conceal the crime. Capon, a Vietnam War veteran and nurse, was identified via fingerprints. The final known victim, Harold Goldberg, 66, was discovered on June 4, 1975, in Lincoln Park. He was discovered in a state of advanced decomposition. Notably, there has been some controversy as to whether Goldberg was a victim of the Doodler, given that he was substantially older than the other men who were slain. In addition to these acts, at least 3 men survived attacks believed to be by the Doodler. And what you're about to hear is extremely unfortunate, as it's proof positive that there was enough evidence to bring this monster to justice, at least at a certain point. In July 1975, within 2 weeks of each other, 2 different men were stabbed in the Fox Plaza area of San Francisco, but managed to survive. One of them later told police he encountered the assailant late at night in a diner that was known to be a gay-friendly hangout by locals. The man had been sketching animal figures on a napkin and claimed to be an art student studying to be a cartoonist. This charming approach, offering a drawing and engaging in conversation, was likely how the perp gained the trust of his victims. The tactic proved tragically effective at luring men to isolated spots. Another survivor in October 1975 spent considerable time with the suspect and provided detectives with a detailed description. These first-hand accounts allowed police to create a composite sketch of the attacker, depicting a young black man with a slender build. From the beginning, the Doodler investigation was hampered by the social climate of the time and the elusive nature of the perpetrator. After the early slayings in 1974, San Francisco police noted the commonalities and realized a single offender might be responsible. The surviving victim's testimony in 1975 was a major break. Their information yielded a police composite sketch in 1975, which was circulated to help identify the suspect. Tips poured in. One anonymous caller even provided a name and a license plate number that pointed to a potential suspect. Acting on these leads, SFPD detectives identified a strong suspect and brought him in for an interview in January 1976. This individual was a young man fitting the description, an African-American male in his early 20s, around 5'11" with a lanky build. By then, however, the string of known Doodler assaults had stopped, and investigators faced a critical hurdle. That is to say, lack of cooperation from key witnesses. Several men had survived encounters with the Doodler, including the two from summer 1975 and one other earlier victim, but none were willing to publicly testify against the suspect. In the 1970s, coming out as a gay man carried immense stigma and personal risk. According to a 1977 report, 2 of the 3 survivors were prominent individuals. One of them was described as, quote, a well-known entertainer, while another was described as a prominent diplomat. Without their testimony, prosecutors had no strong case, since physical evidence linking the suspect to the crimes was scant. The suspect himself cooperated with a police interview but denied committing the acts, and with no willing witnesses and no confession, authorities had to release him. Investigators were convinced they had the right man. One officer later said they strongly believed the detained individual was indeed the Doodler. Decades later, in an effort to reignite the case, San Francisco police artists used this to quote-unquote hypothesize how the Doodler might look as a much older man. And given what we know, and what the police appear to know, I really have to believe this image must be quite exact. The updated rendering was released to the public, reflecting the suspect in his 60s or 70s. Authorities hoped that modern eyes might recognize the face after so many years, and that someone might finally be willing to speak up with information. Throughout the investigation, law enforcement faced numerous challenges beyond uncooperative witnesses. The crimes occurred in an era when forensic technology was limited, DNA profiling didn't exist, and other physical evidence was often not enough to conclusively tie a suspect to a crime, at least to the exacting standards required by our legal system. In one intriguing twist, a psychiatrist contacted police in late 1975, claiming that one of his patients had confessed to being the Doodler. This doctor, known only by the pseudonym Dr. Priest, after the practice of confession, even gave a name to investigators, seemingly corroborating the suspect they had in mind. Yet, because the survivors refused to identify the suspect in court, and the alleged confession came through a second-hand source bound by medical confidentiality, the case didn't progress. By the end of the 1970s, the Doodler investigation had gone cold, despite an array of extremely promising leads that never fully materialized into a resolvable case. It's chilling to note that after the police sketch was publicized and a suspect was interviewed, the doodler stopped his attacks. This suggested that the person responsible was scared by the heat, and also strongly suggests that the interviewed party was the doodler. Given the evidence gathered, police and crime experts have formed theories about who the doodler might be and what drove him to commit this series of heinous acts. The leading theory is that the unnamed man detained in 1976 was indeed the perpetrator. Investigators have quietly kept tabs on this individual over the years. In fact, he remains a person of interest decades later. As of the early 2020s, SFPD confirmed they have re-interviewed the same man and that he is still under suspicion, though he has not been publicly named at present. The man is believed to be living in California's East Bay region and would likely be in his early 70s based on the evidence that's been released. Officially, no charges have ever been filed, but the consensus among those familiar with the case is that authorities have something just shy of certainty as to who the doodler is. And this isn't one of those cases where authorities have a strong inkling. They really seem to have near absolute confirmation as to who the guy actually is. This is a case where we have multiple high-profile people who were unwilling to testify against him due to personal concerns about their orientation coming out in open court. Combine this with the fact that a psychiatrist came forward to advise that the doodler himself confessed, and well, there's a real evidentiary quagmire. All of these parties provided independent confirmation that the doodler was the same person, but due to an unwillingness to testify and medical confidentiality, the authorities have their hands tied. Another important question is, what exactly would drive someone to commit these sick crimes? Both professional criminal profilers and online sleuths have noted that the doodler's pattern suggests a complex and conflicted motive. All evidence indicates that the doodler engaged in relationships with the men before ending them. Some have speculated that the perpetrator might have been grappling with his own identity, and that attempting to repress his identity led to a horrific outbreak in serial violence. Another theory about the doodler's motive is rooted in the social shame of the time. It's important to remember that even in San Francisco in the 1970s, the police had an extremely strained relationship with the gay community. This community had faced decades of abuse at the hands of the authorities. In general, at best, the community was wary of the police. Since all known victims were part of the community, even if only on a closeted basis, the perpetrator may have chose to operate in a community reluctant to engage with law enforcement. Some investigators theorize he deliberately targeted men who, he assumed, would be reluctant to report attacks. This could point to a predator who cynically took advantage of society's bias. Unfortunately, I have some doubts about whether the doodler will ever be brought to justice, and this fact is made more concerning by the fact that he is likely still alive. At present, given that the doodler is subject to an active and ongoing investigation, it's unclear if his DNA evidence has been logged. However, given that the suspect has been re-interviewed in recent years, I suspect this isn't the case. At present, the most realistic chance appears to be having the authorities lean on one of the witnesses who survived their encounters with this monster. If any of these three men are still alive, they likely hold the only remaining keys to realistically cracking these cases and bringing justice for the victims. Also, as I was editing, I realized why the doodler likely never struck again. I suspect that given the strength of the evidence against him, the SFPD has likely had this guy under intermittent surveillance for the last half-century. Kurt McFall was born on December 9th, 1966, in San Diego, California. Growing up in a suburban environment, he was known to be a bright and popular student at Clayton Valley High School. Friends described him as confident, energetic, and caring. He participated in extracurricular activities such as the school newspaper and yearbook clubs, and was passionate about subjects like math and science. Aside from academics, Kurt loved the outdoors and was an avid participant in recreational activities, including swimming and cliff climbing. His early interest in Dungeons and Dragons eventually led him to join the Society for Creative Anachronism, a group dedicated to reviving medieval customs. On Saturday, September 8, 1984, Kurt left his home in Concord, California, and drove across the Bay Bridge into San Francisco. He planned to spend the night with a friend and return home on Sunday evening. However, what transpired that night remains uncertain. According to accounts from those close to him, Kurt had grown increasingly involved in a world far removed from his upbringing. In addition to his participation in the SCA, he had become interested in the occult and had joined a group focused on pagan religion. A high school friend later revealed that Kurt had mentioned his involvement in a satanic cult that dabbled in black magic. The friend explained that Kurt felt trapped by the group and feared for his life if he tried to leave. 2 days after his disappearance, on Monday, September 10th, 1984, two birdwatchers exploring the rugged cliffs at Land's End in San Francisco Bay made a grim discovery. They found the bruised and half-naked body of Kurt McFall on a remote beach below the cliffs. His body was missing a shirt, shoes, and socks, and it displayed multiple traumatic injuries, along with severe blood loss. The physical condition of his body was puzzling. Despite the injuries, there were only minor abrasions noted on parts of his body, and there was no sign of substances in his system. Notably, empty beer bottles were scattered around his abandoned car. This car was found on a golf course overlooking the ocean, and investigators noted several other unusual details at the scene. His driver's license was discovered on the floor, and his car keys were left on the seat. Notably, the prized suit of armor he had purchased for his SCA activities was missing from the trunk. The San Francisco coroner determined that Kurt died from multiple traumatic injuries and severe blood loss. While the report suggested that his injuries were consistent with a fall from the cliff, it also noted that the precise cause of those injuries could not be conclusively established. Initially, investigators believed that the death was caused by a probable accidental fall from climbing the cliffs. However, the coroner himself later remarked that an intentional act was a plausible cause, even though there was insufficient evidence to file criminal charges. As a result, the death was officially classified as unknown and left the case unresolved. One of the most controversial aspects of the case involves Gabriel Carrillo, who used the Welsh name Caradoc in his role as a leader within a neo-pagan group. Carrillo was known to have befriended Kurt and allowed him to spend nights at his apartment. On the night of his death, Carrillo recounted that Kurt had gone swimming at Ocean Beach and later knocked on his door around 3 a.m., stating that he was returning to the beach. Carrillo suggested that Kurt may have taken too many risks that night and possibly slipped or was caught by an undertow. While Carrillo maintained that Kurt's death was an accident, Kurt's father and some of his friends remained suspicious of his account. Over the years, several theories have been put forward to explain Kurt McFall's mysterious death. The first theory is the simplest, that he sustained injuries as the result of an accidental fall. Given the treacherous nature of the cliffs at Land's End, it's entirely plausible that Kurt may have lost his footing while climbing or while trying to get into the water. Supporters of this theory point to the lack of trauma on his body supportive of a struggle. Another theory is that Kurt was pushed off the cliff, suggesting foul play. This perspective is largely influenced by the observations of his father, Tom McFall, who firmly believes that his son didn't die by accident. Tom argued that Kurt would have been more adept at handling the cliff terrain. However, what I think might be missing from this perspective is the fact that one should absolutely not be climbing cliffs at night, let alone on dark and stormy nights. Further, he found that the peculiar staging at the scene, such as the beer bottles around the car and the missing suit of armor, indicates deliberate tampering. And quick note, as I was editing the video for this, I realized I left out a key fact about the beer bottles. Kurt's friends and family confirmed that he wasn't a drinker. Now, I don't put a lot of weight in his dad saying that, but the fact that all his friends agreed as well is definitely important. A third explanation claims that the crime scene was altered after Kurt's death. According to discussions on various forums, some believe that local vagrants or opportunistic individuals might have come upon Kurt's abandoned car and tampered with the scene. They suggest that the beer bottles and other items may have been left by these individuals, rather than being part of a larger occult conspiracy. This theory attempts to reconcile the accidental fall scenario with the oddities found at the car, arguing that the scene might have been unintentionally changed by unrelated parties. Kurt's case captured public attention largely because it emerged during the height of the satanic panic of the 1980s. It was often presented in a sensationalist way, attempting to tie his death into broader popular narratives that were being pushed in the media at the time. In my opinion, the most likely explanation for Kurt McFall's tragic death is that it was simply an accident. The available evidence, including his autopsy showing no signs of substances, suggests that a fall from the precarious cliffs of Land's End was a misfortune rather than a deliberate act. While occult theories are tempting, the simplest explanation often proves true, and in this case, an accidental fall appears to be the most plausible scenario. Also, I note that Gabriel Carrillo was portrayed as a Satanist at the time, but having looked into it further, he was a Wiccan with an interest in ancient Celtic traditions. I found a whole bunch of unverified accounts online from people who claim to have known him as Caradoc. Every account I've read says that he was interested in white magic and doing good and positive things in the world. It sounds much less sinister when presented that way in my view, and I think media sensationalism and the satanic panic overlay had a lot to do with this mystery. Sherry Roach was a 17-year-old living in a group home in San Mateo, California in 1976. She and her younger brother Jerry had endured a turbulent childhood in Santa Rosa, growing up in what Jerry described as a violent household. This instability led Sherry to spend time in multiple foster homes and group homes for her care and safety. However, these environments were, to put it mildly, less than ideal, and Sherry often ran away. Despite all these challenges, Sherry remained extremely close with her brother. Jerry recalled that whenever Sherry ran away, as she often did, she would always reach out to let him know she was safe. By June 1976, Sherry was staying at a group home in San Mateo. She also held a part-time job in San Francisco, which is about 20 miles away from San Mateo. She often relied on public transit or hitchhiking to get to and from work, the latter of which wasn't uncommon for teens in the 1970s. On the morning of June 8, 1976, Sherry left the group home to catch a bus to her job in San Francisco. It was a routine she had done many times before. However, on this day, she never arrived back at the group home. A counselor at the home reported Sherry missing when she failed to return from work as expected. When Sherry's disappearance was reported, the San Mateo Police Department launched an investigation, though by today's standards it was relatively limited. According to Detective Tom Paulin of the San Mateo Police Department, speaking in February 2020, quote, "The officers back in 1976 did a cursory interview with some people that either worked with her or that knew of her, and there weren't any substantial leads at that particular time." Reading between the lines, it appears that they simply assumed she was a runaway, and because she had little in the way of family to advocate for her, her case went cold. Indeed, Sherry had a known history of running away from home or foster placements, which may have led authorities to suspect she left voluntarily. However, given Sherry's pattern of always calling her brother when she ran off, the fact that no one heard from her at all after June 1976 was deeply alarming. This departure from her usual behavior suggested that Sherry hadn't simply started a new life elsewhere, Something had prevented her from making contact. Although the investigation went cold, it was never fully closed. Given that Sherry frequently hitchhiked, investigators considered the grim possibility that she could have fallen prey to a predator who targeted young women. As any true crime aficionado knows, California in the 1970s was the epicenter of a serial predator epidemic. Investigators also looked into unusual cases like the November 1978 Jonestown incident in Guyana, which involved many Bay Area residents. Yet upon further investigation, Sherry's name didn't appear on the lists of those who perished in that tragedy. Decades passed with little progress until a surprising new clue emerged in 2020. Sherry's mother, who still lived in Northern California, discovered an old photograph while going through family belongings. The photo, dated 1975 on the back, showed Sherry as a teenager, standing close to an unidentified young man with his arm around her shoulders. What made the discovery significant is that Sherry's family had never seen this picture before, nor did they recognize the man in it. In fact, relatives had only heard vague rumors back in the 1970s that Sherry might have had an older boyfriend, but they had no name or details. The newly unearthed photo was potentially one of the last pictures taken of Sherry before she disappeared, and the man beside her immediately became a person of interest. San Mateo police publicly released the photo in February 2020 in hopes that someone might identify the mystery man. Authorities have described him as a black male, likely in his early 20s and approximately 6 feet tall. Notably, the man has not officially been labeled a suspect, but given that he was apparently close to Sherry not long before she vanished, police consider him a critical witness at the very least. Despite the release of this picture, no new evidence has come from it, and the man has not been identified. Zoe McClellan, an American actress known for her roles on JAG and NCIS New Orleans, has been at the center of a disturbing disappearance. McClellan and her young son, Sebastian, vanished in 2021 amid a protracted custody battle with her ex-husband, actor J.P. Gillane. McClellan's personal troubles began after her 2016 divorce. In 2017, their custody dispute escalated when McClellan moved to Toronto for a filming job and brought then 4-year-old Sebastian with her. Gillane accused her of violating their custody agreement by taking the child out of state without sufficient notice. He even filed child abduction charges against McClellan at the time. However, a court ultimately ruled in McClellan's favor in that dispute. A judge determined that McClellan's move was work-related and not an abduction, noting it was known to both parents that her acting career might require travel. In fact, McClellan was deemed the primary parent, and she had support from NCIS colleagues who provided testimonials on her behalf. This early legal victory for McClellan set the stage for an increasingly bitter custody saga. On April 16, 2019, Zoe McClellan and her son effectively disappeared from public view for the first time. According to Gillane, he had not seen or heard from McClellan or their child since April 2019, when she allegedly fled with the boy. Gillane reported the situation to the authorities, characterizing McClellan's actions as a parental kidnapping. Initially, the matter was treated as a custody violation, but as time passed with no contact, it became a missing persons case for the child. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office eventually got involved, and Sebastian was registered with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children as an abducted child. McClellan was named as the abductor in official bulletins, which noted that mother and son went missing from Los Angeles and might have traveled elsewhere. At this stage, the priority for law enforcement was to locate the child and ensure his safety. McClellan eventually resurfaced with Sebastian, but things were about to go even further off the rails. In a dramatic turn of events, J.P. Ghislaine himself became the subject of a criminal investigation in late 2019, which affected the trajectory of the case. McClellan had long claimed that her ex-husband was dangerous to their son, and those allegations appeared to gain credibility when Ghislaine was arrested in January 2020. However, Ghislaine's legal ordeal was short-lived. After spending a few months in jail, Ghislaine was released in mid-2020 when prosecutors dropped the charges due to insufficient evidence. The resolution of the criminal case against Ghislaine shifted the focus back to Zoe McClellan. In September 2020, a California family court awarded sole custody of Sebastian to Ghislaine and ordered McClellan to surrender the child to his father. McClellan, however, never complied. She had stopped participating in court hearings by late 2020, and her attorneys didn't respond to court filings. In April 2021, a judge directed the LA County District Attorney's Child Abduction Unit to use all necessary means to find McClellan and her son. Shortly thereafter, on May 14, 2021, a felony arrest warrant was formally issued for Zoe McClellan on charges of kidnapping. With a warrant in place, law enforcement efforts intensified. Los Angeles authorities coordinated with other jurisdictions where McClellan had ties, including Louisiana, and alerts were disseminated nationwide. McClellan and her son were entered into national missing persons databases. In July 2021, a California judge scheduled a hearing and ordered McClellan to appear on July 15, 2021, and hand over Sebastian to his father. McClellan failed to show up in court, as many expected, given that her whereabouts were still unknown. By mid-2021, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department confirmed it had no leads on McClellan's location. As authorities and private investigators pursued the case, theories about McClellan's whereabouts have emerged. Because she has ties to both California and Louisiana, those areas have been focal points. Early in the search, sources speculated that McClellan stayed in Louisiana, possibly living off the grid to avoid detection. In fact, Los Angeles investigators initially got hints in 2021 that she might be hiding somewhere near New Orleans. McClellan had lived in the region during NCIS and still had friends or contacts there, which could provide a support network for laying low. And it's important to remember that McClellan's official story is that her ex-husband is a very dangerous person. It's possible that the person or people harboring her and her son believe they're actually saving Sebastian from a horrific fate. On the other hand, there is the possibility that she left the United States entirely. Some reports suggested McClellan might have fled across the border to Canada, given her previous residence in Toronto and the fact that she had worked there before. Others have speculated that given her drastic and disturbing actions thus far, Zoe and her son may no longer be among the living. And just as a quick aside, I'm somewhat surprised this case hasn't gotten way more attention, given the involvement of a decently well-known celebrity. On January 11, 1987, a group of children playing in Daly City, California, came upon the body of a young woman concealed in the bushes in front of a residence. They alerted authorities, and the San Mateo County coroner and Daly City police soon determined that the woman had been slain recently, likely only hours before her discovery. The victim showed obvious signs of foul play, including trauma to her neck, indicating she had been strangled. Investigators noted that the remains bore no identification of any kind. This absence of personal items suggested she might have been living as a transient. A forensic autopsy was conducted to establish exactly how Jane Doe died and to gather clues about who she was. Toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of two antidepressant medications, imipramine and desipramine, in her system. These substances were not used recreationally, and the medical examiner found no evidence that she was a substance addict. Coupled with further injuries, including a cut lip and bruising on her face, Authorities surmised that the overdose had been forced on her against her will. Beyond the COD, the coroner's examination provided a detailed physical description of the Jane Doe, which investigators hoped would match a missing person report. She was believed to be a white or possibly Hispanic female between 25 and 30 years old, standing around 5 feet 3 inches tall. Notably, she had extremely rough calluses on her hands, providing strong circumstantial evidence that she worked in a physical capacity. She was also generally noted to have an unkempt appearance, strongly indicating that she had fallen on hard times and lending more weight to the theory that she was a transient. Further, and perhaps most importantly, the coroner was able to determine that she had given birth at least once in her life. At the crime scene, investigators collected numerous pieces of evidence from the victim's body and the surrounding area. These items were documented in hopes they might provide leads to her identity or the circumstances of the crime. The victim was dressed in multiple layers of clothing, likely due to lack of shelter and a safe storage spot. For example, on her upper body she wore a jacket, a lavender sweatshirt with a hood, a pullover sweater, and a blue shirt. Near the body, police found a pill container bearing the name of a pharmacy located in Concord, California. The bottle's label was partially illegible, and it was empty, though investigators have strong reason to believe it was related to the act. Its presence was a puzzling clue, as Concord is a city about 40 miles away. It suggested the victim or the perpetrator likely had some connection to that area, since the prescription pills used aren't ones that had any meaningful street value. Investigators recognized a matchbook from Vern's Diner, a local restaurant in Daly City. This indicated the woman had recently visited or passed through that diner, but we'll come back to this in a moment. Fingerprint impressions were successfully lifted from the victim and submitted to law enforcement databases across the country. However, the fingerprint search received no hits, indicating that she had likely never been arrested previously. The victim's dental characteristics were recorded as well, and quick-thinking investigators were careful to preserve her DNA profile. While DNA analysis wasn't available in 1987, her DNA profile was later put into a national database, though again this yielded no results. Detectives also attempted to reconstruct the victim's last known activities. Following the clue of the Vern's Diner matchbook, detectives canvassed that area for witnesses. These inquiries produced a few promising leads. It was reported that earlier on the day of the slayings, a woman matching Jane Doe's description had been making a purchase at the restaurant. Also, when I was searching up Vern's Diner, it looks like it was a real fixture in the community for a number of years. I'm basing this on the number of Facebook posts I was able to find, saying something along the lines of, "You're not really from Daly City if you didn't go to Vern's back in the day." Around that same time, some people across the street were holding a garage sale. They recalled seeing what appeared to be the young woman in an argument with an unidentified man not far from the diner. They saw the two involved in some kind of altercation, but did not intervene, and unfortunately, they didn't know either individual. By the time police followed up, no one in the neighborhood recognized the description of the woman or could provide her name. The man seen arguing with her was never located. This was a frustrating dead end, although it strongly indicated that the victim had encountered foul play from that unknown male. It provided no names or motives. With no identification and no obvious suspect, the case faced challenges. However, the unusual nature of the crime, a combination of poisoning and strangulation, led to speculation that this might not have been an isolated incident. The method of slaying suggested a degree of planning and cruelty that could point to a serial offender. Over the years, investigators and crime analysts discussed the possibility that the perpetrator might have struck before or would strike again. A significant development in the case came over 2 decades later, in 2011. That year, authorities re-examined the evidence due to a potential link with a known serial offender. Joseph Nasso, a former resident of the Bay Area, had been arrested in April 2011 and charged with the slayings of several women. Nasso was an older man who, it turned out, had committed a string of slayings between the late 1970s to the mid-1990s, targeting women in California. His known victims had all been strangled and their bodies dumped in remote areas. When Nasso's crimes came to light, detectives in Daly City noted similarities between his modus operandi and the Jane Doe case. Both involved a female victim in roughly the same age range, barehanded strangulation, and a Northern California setting. Although the Jane Doe's death involved the additional twist of a forced overdose, the investigators felt it was plausible Nasso could have been involved. Now, personally, I think the overdose element is really what sets this case apart. But one thing we have to remember is that we don't have all the evidence that the authorities do. For open investigations, the authorities theoretically only reveal information and evidence tactically, in a way that potentially leads towards resolution. As a result of this lead, the San Mateo County Jane Doe case saw a flurry of new forensic activity in 2011. Investigators decided to perform an exhumation of Jane Doe's remains to gather additional evidence. The hope was that modern forensic techniques might reveal DNA traces of the perpetrator. Any unknown DNA profile obtained would then be compared against known offenders. The results of this effort were never announced, which isn't to say that Nasso was ruled out, but rather it's possible that no additional evidence could be found. Ultimately, we don't know if there was no DNA recovered, or if the DNA recovered simply didn't match with Joseph Nasso. So this is yet another case where I really think that genetic genealogy holds the key to giving the San Mateo Jane Doe her identity back, as well as potentially catching the perp. According to my research, there's nothing to indicate that a forensic genetic genealogy company has been retained by the San Mateo Sheriff's Office at this point. As with any case that may be solved with genetic genealogy, a big part of why cases aren't sent for this service is due to lack of public awareness of the case. On the morning of October 3, 1972, a Southern Pacific Railroad work crew spotted smoke rising from a remote hillside near an Interstate 80 overpass outside Baxter, California. What they initially thought might be a brush fire or burning log turned out to be the smoldering body of an unidentified man wrapped in blankets. The Placer County Sheriff described the scene as a grisly slaying. The victim had apparently been beaten before being doused with a flammable liquid, wrapped in bedding, and set afire, his body then dumped by the roadside. The flames were still burning when the crew arrived, and an autopsy later confirmed the man had smoke in his lungs, indicating he was alive while being burned. This unknown victim would come to be known only as the Placer County John Doe. The forensic examination of the body revealed shocking evidence of neglect even before the slaying. Although the intense fire charred his remains, pathologists uncovered multiple injuries and health issues. The man had suffered a broken left arm roughly 6 to 8 weeks before death, which had never been set or treated. Several of his ribs were also broken, and he had a severe head injury inflicted within a day of death. Investigators found numerous bed sores on his back, suggesting he had been bedridden for an extended period. The bottoms of his feet were unusually smooth and soft, as if he had not walked in a long time or perhaps even ever. Despite being around 5 feet 10 inches, the man weighed only about 110 to 130 pounds. He appeared emaciated, indicating periods of prolonged malnourishment. Further, the victim's fingernails were grown out about 3/4 of an inch long, and his teeth were in extremely poor condition. A dentist who examined the teeth said it was doubtful the man had ever received dental care in his life. He was wearing only a white hospital-type gown and socks when found, indicating he may have come from a quote-unquote care facility setting. These findings painted a tragic picture. The John Doe appeared to have been a disabled, bedridden individual who suffered at the hands of those who were supposed to care for him. Investigators believed the victim couldn't fend for himself, making the cruelty of this case all the more disgusting. Sheriff's detectives immediately began working to identify the victim and find whoever was responsible. Because the John Doe had no identification and couldn't be matched to any recent missing person reports, investigators focused on the clues suggesting he had been under institutional care. The hospital gown, bed sores, and general condition led to early speculation that the man had recently been a patient in a hospital, nursing home, or long-term care facility. Detectives pursued this lead aggressively. Over 100 care facilities in California, Nevada, and neighboring states were contacted. No facility acknowledged a missing patient matching his description, however, and this avenue went cold. Other investigative efforts were equally exhaustive. Forensic attempts to identify the man were limited by the condition of the body. Fingerprints were difficult to obtain from his charred remains, though detectives managed to recover a single fingerprint. When they checked it against state and FBI databases of prints, no match was found. This one fingerprint and the victim's dental characteristics were recorded in case a future match might be possible. No personal items or unique identifiers were found with the body. However, one of the blankets used was a U.S. Army blanket, which led authorities to consider whether the victim was a disabled veteran or if the perp had been in the military. This avenue of investigation ultimately came to nothing as well. Despite the massive investigative effort, the Placer County John Doe case went cold. The victim's body was held in a Sacramento County morgue refrigerator for 8 months after the slaying, as authorities waited and hoped that someone would come forward to identify him. Unfortunately, no family member, caregiver, or acquaintance ever did. So in my view, this is a case that could be readily resolved with a little bit of work from those wizards we call forensic genetic genealogists. And unlike on most cold cases I talk about, I actually have really positive news to report here. Othram, the leading service provider for genetic genealogy, confirmed in a February 2025 post on the Websleuths forum that they are taking a look into this case. That said, at present, it isn't known if DNA evidence has been preserved, and the victim was buried in a pauper's grave, which may be difficult to locate. Also, funding is a major issue for cases like these that have been virtually forgotten. So if you want to see justice for people like the Placer County John Doe, consider supporting something like the DNA Doe Project, or your local equivalent. Kajara Fraze was a 22-year-old from Moreno Valley, California, who was 35 weeks pregnant when she vanished under eerie circumstances in early 2023. Late on the evening of February 23, 2023, Kajara and her parents were driving to visit her grandmother when they decided to stop for a quick meal. They pulled into the drive-thru of a Jack in the Box restaurant on Beaumont Avenue in the city of Beaumont around 10:30 p.m. As they waited in the drive-thru line, Kajara suddenly asked to get out of the van to get some fresh air, which her parents found unusual but didn't object to. According to Kara, her mother, Kajara stepped out of the vehicle and walked a short distance to the front of the drive-thru lane, carrying only her Bible with her. She left behind her purse and cell phone in the back seat of the car, suggesting she hadn't planned a long absence. Kajara's father, Jamal, continued to inch the car forward in line to pay for their order while keeping an eye on his daughter. But in a matter of minutes, Kajara was gone. After Jamal paid and the car pulled up again, they realized their daughter was no longer visible near the drive-thru. Alarmed, Kajara's parents immediately grabbed their food and circled around to search for her. They looked in the parking lot, inside the fast food restaurant, and around the immediate area, but there was no sign of Kajara. By 10:40 p.m., they knew something was very wrong, and they called 911 to report her missing. Beaumont police officers responded and began a search of the area that night. Local authorities launched an extensive investigation into Kajara's disappearance. Early on, police classified her as a voluntary missing adult, since she was of age and had reportedly walked away on her own accord. Nonetheless, given her pregnancy, detectives took the case seriously and began gathering any clues they could. They canvassed the area for witnesses and sought out surveillance video from nearby businesses. Unfortunately, a significant delay occurred in retrieving security camera footage from the restaurant and surrounding establishments. By the time investigators went to pull the videos, nearly a month later, most of the recordings had been overwritten and lost. The only useful footage came from a security camera at a nearby school, which captured an image of Kajara walking by herself. She was heading south through the parking lot and moving away from the fast food joint. In that video, she was wearing the same clothes her parents described and appeared to be walking purposefully, though it's unclear where she was heading. Over the following days and weeks, Beaumont police and partner agencies carried out extensive searches on the ground and by air. Officers and volunteers combed the area on foot and with K-9 units, while drones, helicopters, and even airplanes surveyed the wider region. Authorities also checked with local hospitals and clinics for any woman matching Kajara's description who might have come in to give birth, since her due date was approaching. Alerts with her information were sent to medical facilities, shelters, and mental health centers in all surrounding counties. Investigators also analyzed her social media activity and phone records for any hints of her plans or communications around the time she disappeared. Kajara's place of employment and other frequented locations were checked as well, but nothing turned up. Crucially, no transactions or sightings of Kajara have been recorded since that night, and it was as if she fell off the face of the earth. In a March 8, 2023 press release, Beaumont police noted that the family was not cooperatively working with detectives to provide additional information. Kajara's mother strongly disputed this characterization by the police. In a statement to local media, Kara insisted that the family had cooperated 100% with Beaumont detectives. Notably, having reviewed the Beaumont press release, they do not say that the family is not working with police, but rather that they aren't working with them cooperatively. This is very strange language on the part of the investigators, because they're explicitly not saying that the family hasn't been providing information. Reading between the lines, I suspect this statement by the Beaumont police is extremely poorly worded and reflects the difference in views between the family and the cops. At any rate, Kara was frustrated by the implication that they were hindering the case and suggested instead that the police response was too slow in the crucial early hours. Kara alleged that officers were slow to officially file the missing person report and lacked urgency on the night of February 23rd. She believes that this resulted in nearly all the surveillance video in the area expiring before it could be reviewed. This loss of potential evidence has been a sore point, as it closed off one of the best chances to track Kajara's movements immediately after she walked away. Kajara's mom makes an absolutely excellent point here. I simply don't see how the surveillance camera evidence wasn't obtained on the night in question given the urgency of the situation. More than 2 years have passed since Kajara Frey's disappeared, and in the absence of concrete answers, several theories have emerged about what might have happened. Importantly, investigators have not identified any suspects or confirmed any specific theory. One possibility is that Kajara left of her own accord to start a new life. Police initially treated her case as a voluntary missing adult, since witnesses, her parents, saw her walking away under her own power, and there were no immediate signs of struggle. It's conceivable she was overwhelmed by the impending birth and decided to run away. However, many find this theory unlikely given her excitement about the baby and the fact that she left behind personal items like her phone and purse. Further, Authorities also found no evidence of her establishing a new identity, using credit cards, or contacting friends after February 23rd. Some believe she may have been suffering a medical or mental health emergency that night, which could explain her sudden decision to leave. As some have mentioned in online forums such as Reddit, psychosis can arise as a result of pregnancy and can also just generally come to the surface around one's early 20s. Kara has mentioned that her daughter might have been in a distressed or confused state of mind when she stepped out of the car. Under this scenario, Kajara could have wandered off disoriented and possibly sought shelter or help from a stranger. The fact that she took only her Bible with her might indicate she was seeking some sort of comfort. If she did experience a mental health crisis, one fear is that she could have become lost or injured in the cold night. Kajara's mother strongly suspects that someone else became involved after her daughter walked away. This theory suggests that an opportunistic predator encountered Kajara when she left the drive-thru. Given Kajara's vulnerable condition, it's conceivable someone coerced her into a vehicle. To date, police say they have no evidence that Kajara was abducted or met with foul play, and unfortunately, that's where her case stands today. In July 1981, a 14-year-old girl named Stacey Ann Arris vanished during a trip to Yosemite National Park and was never seen again. Stacey was visiting the park with her father and a group of other campers when she disappeared from the vicinity of Sunrise High Sierra Camp, a remote backcountry lodge area at 9,400 feet. Despite one of the most intensive search operations in Yosemite's history, no sign of Stacey, aside from a single small clue, was ever found. But let's back it up a moment, since the circumstances surrounding her disappearance are highly unusual. They were part of a group of about 10 people, including a guide or two, touring the park's High Sierra Camp Loop, a popular way for visitors to experience Yosemite's high country. On July 17, 1981, the party rode on mules from Tuolumne Meadows to the Sunrise High Sierra Camp, a cluster of cabins near several alpine lakes. They arrived at this camp around mid-afternoon, approximately 3 p.m., and dismounted their mules and set in to rest for the evening. Stacey and her father were assigned to share one of the simple cabins at the camp, and after arriving, she decided to freshen up. She took a quick shower and changed clothes, initially slipping on casual sandals as she relaxed from the day's ride. Not long after getting settled, Stacey told her father that she wanted to take her camera and walk a short distance to photograph one of the nearby lakes. The Sunrise High Sierra Camp sits close to a series of small backcountry lakes, and it was a clear summer afternoon. Simply put, it was a seemingly perfect opportunity for a few scenic pictures. Stacey invited her father to come along, but he was tired and declined. Instead, another member of their group, a 77-year-old man named Gerald Stewart, agreed to accompany her on the short hike. Before they set off, Stacey's father advised her to change out of her sandals and put on hiking boots, given the rough terrain on the trail. She did so, lacing up a pair of gray hiking boots as recommended. At around 4 p.m., by most accounts, Stacey, carrying her small Olympus camera, headed out on the trail toward the closest lake, with the elderly man walking beside her. The trail from the camp to the nearest lake is only about 1 mile. However, despite this, Stacey and old Mr. Stewart walked only part of that distance together. After a short way, the old man began to tire due to the uphill terrain and decided to stop and rest on a boulder along the trail. Despite old Mr. Stewart stopping, Stacey was still eager to reach a good vantage point by the water. She reportedly told him that she would walk ahead to find a nice spot by the lake and would return in just a few minutes. As Mr. Stewart sat down, one of the tour guides, who happened to be working near the camp's horse corral not far away, briefly spotted Stacey on her own. The guide later recounted seeing the teenage girl standing on a rock about 50 yards off the trail, looking out toward the lake, before she stepped out of view behind some trees. That was the last confirmed sighting of Stacey Arras. When Stacey didn't return promptly, the campers, including her dad, immediately raised an alarm. Within minutes, members of her group grew concerned and went searching for her along the path and around the lake shore, but she was nowhere to be found. Initially, her father and others from the group searched the immediate area, calling out her name and checking the trail and lake shore where she had headed. As evening approached with still no sign of Stacey, park staff at the High Sierra camp also joined the effort, scouring the vicinity until nightfall. At first light the next morning, July 18, 1981, the National Park Service launched a full-scale search and rescue operation. Over the following days, this search would grow into one of the largest in Yosemite history. Dozens of park rangers, trained search and rescue personnel, and volunteers converged on the backcountry around Sunrise High Sierra Camp to look for the missing girl. Eventually, more than 100 people were involved at the peak of the hunt, aided by dog teams, professional mountain climbers, divers, and helicopter support. The park's helicopter alone flew over 40 hours during the operation, ferrying search teams and scanning the ground from above. Teams of divers were dispatched to search the nearby lakes in case Stacey had fallen into the water. Canine units were also brought in to track any scent or trail. Every resource available was thrown into the urgent effort to find the missing teen. One small clue did emerge during the search. About a day into the operation, searchers discovered a camera part on the ground, believed to belong to Stacey. Reports vary slightly, but multiple sources indicate that the lens cap of her camera was found near the tree line between the camp and the lake, in the area where she had last been seen. This suggested that she had indeed reached that vicinity, and something may have occurred there. Perhaps the cap popped off as she fell, or perhaps it fell off during some kind of struggle, but unfortunately the cap by itself didn't tell investigators much. Further, it's not clear to me from the evidence if this was ever confirmed, with absolute certainty, to be Stacey's lens cap. Beyond that single item, no other trace of Stacey Arras was ever recovered. As one Yosemite official put it at the time, quote, "She just seems to have disappeared from that spot." The formal search continued intensively for over a week. On the 9th day of intensive searching, with thousands of man-hours invested and still no sign of the girl, officials made the difficult decision to scale back the operation. The massive search was suspended after exhaustively covering the primary area of interest. In the absence of conclusive evidence, several theories have been proposed over the years to explain the disappearance of Stacey Arras. Investigators at the time kept an open mind, considering everything from an accident to foul play. The most straightforward theory is that Stacey was the victim of a misstep or accident in the wilderness. Yosemite's backcountry can be dangerous, especially for someone wandering alone off trail, even for a short distance. One possibility is that she might have slipped on the granite slabs or loose rocks near the lake and fallen into an unseen crevice or canyon. A search team member noted there were many places where a body could slip in or remain hidden in that area. If Stacey was injured from a fall, she may have tried to shelter herself, for instance, crawling under a rock overhang or into a hollow log to escape the cold night. Such concealment, while a natural instinct for survival, could have made her even harder to find. It's also possible she became disoriented while looking for the lake and wandered farther than intended, getting lost in the labyrinth of similar-looking terrain. Despite the thorough search, an accident scenario cannot be ruled out. The wilderness is vast, and even intensive searches have been known to miss clues or remains, especially if someone moved beyond the initial search grid. Related to the accident theory is the idea that Stacy might have drowned in the lake she set out for. Perhaps she reached the water's edge and, for reasons unknown, she fell into the lake and could not get out. However, this theory seems less likely given the search efforts. Rescue teams did deploy divers to thoroughly probe the lakes for any sign of her, but found absolutely nothing. Early on, park officials didn't dismiss the possibility of wild animal involvement, though they found no direct evidence for it. Yosemite is home to black bears and mountain lions, both of which could attack a human, especially a lone teenager. Some have speculated that perhaps a mountain lion, which can silently stalk prey, might have pounced on Stacy, dragged her away, and hidden her remains. However, there are several points against this. First, attacks on humans by predators in Yosemite are exceedingly rare. For instance, black bears in that park are generally interested in campers' food, not attacking people, and fatal mountain lion attacks in California are very uncommon. Second, a struggle with a large animal typically leaves signs: torn clothing, blood, tracks, or drag marks. The search teams did not report finding any such evidence. The only item found was the camera lens cap, which in itself showed no marks indicating an animal encounter. If a bear or cougar had taken Stacy, search dogs might have picked up the scent of an animal or blood, but the dogs detected nothing. The animal attack theory is considered theoretically possible, but extremely improbable given the balance of evidence. Another theory is that Stacy Harris could have been the victim of foul play, perhaps an abduction or slaying concealed in the wilderness. Investigators kept this theory on the table, and in fact, a park official stated that foul play has not been ruled out during the initial search. However, there are challenges to this idea. Stacy disappeared in a relatively short window of time, mere minutes, in broad daylight, with other people not far away. For a stranger to abduct her, that person would likely have had to be hiding out of sight near the lake, and then acted incredibly quickly and quietly. The area is remote, and there's no road access nearby for over 2 miles. Therefore, it would be difficult for a criminal to be lurking there, and then transport a victim out of the area without being noticed by the search teams converging soon after. Further, the terrain required to get to a road is extremely difficult, making such an abduction very difficult. Nonetheless, it's not impossible that she encountered someone with ill intentions, perhaps a lone hiker, or even an employee or member of her group, and met with foul play. All members of Stacy's own travel group were presumably interviewed by authorities. There has never been any public indication that someone in the group was suspected, or that any evidence pointed to a specific individual. The elderly man who was with her, Gerald Stewart, was one of the last to see her, and naturally some armchair detectives have wondered if he could have harmed her. Personally, while I see why people are skeptical of him in this situation, all accounts report he was a fairly frail 77-year-old man. Search parties converged upon the area extremely rapidly, and I simply doubt that he had the ability to hide Stacy in rough terrain in the short window of time available. Further again, there's simply no trace of her whatsoever, beyond a small bit of her camera. Due to the baffling lack of evidence, Stacy Harris's case has often been labeled as unexplained. It's one of those disappearances that, even after exhaustive efforts, offers no clear answers. In particular, this is a case that has attracted attention from individuals such as David Paulides in his controversial Missing 411 series. And it's not hard to tell why a paranormal-focused theory has attached itself to this case, since the evidence we have simply doesn't add up to any rational likely answer. Whatever the truth is, the fact is that over 40 years after Stacy Harris's disappearance, we're no closer to that truth today than the investigators were on the day she disappeared. In early 2025, nearly 60 years after Dorothy Vaillancourt disappeared, authorities finally put a name to a mystery that had haunted Northern California for decades. A set of unidentified remains found on a hillside in 1966 was positively identified as Dorothy, an Australian-born mother of 7. For decades, she was known only as the Marin County Jane Doe, but advancements in forensic DNA technology eventually cracked the case and brought partial closure to her family. Despite this, another question now looms. What happened to Dorothy and why? On December 18, 1966, a local hunter made a grim discovery near the end of Paradise Drive in Tiburon, California. He stumbled upon the body of a woman at the bottom of a brush-covered cliffside, about 20 feet down the hill from the roadside. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, and the coroner later estimated that the woman had been dead for approximately 2 months. The woman appeared to be middle-aged, roughly between 40 and 60 years old, standing about 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing around 105 pounds. Due to the condition of the body, authorities could not immediately determine how she had died. No obvious cause of death could be established from the remains. It was clear, however, that this woman had died alone on a quiet Marin County hillside, and that no one had reported her missing. Investigators with the Marin County Sheriff's Office began working to identify the unknown woman. In the 1960s, tools like DNA profiling and nationwide databases didn't exist, so detectives relied on traditional methods. They checked missing persons reports, sent out bulletins across California, and scoured local leads. There was speculation that she might have been a patient who wandered away from a San Francisco psychiatric hospital or a traveler who had stayed at a nearby motel. Each lead, however, led nowhere, and the woman's identity remained a mystery. A crucial clue emerged a few days after the body's discovery. A Tiburon fireman came forward on December 21, 1966, to report an encounter he had remembered from 3 months prior. He told the sheriff's investigators that back in the late summer or early fall, a woman matching the Jane Doe's description had showed up at the local fire station. The woman had told the fireman she was stranded and didn't have money for a taxi ride. She asked if she could spend the night at the fire station or even borrow the firefighter's car, but he refused both requests and didn't take any further action. The fireman last saw her walking away down Tiburon Boulevard in September 1966. This witness account strongly suggested that the unidentified woman found in December was the same person, meaning she had been alive and in distress a few months before her death. Despite this lead, investigators still did not know her name. With no identification and no immediate matches to missing persons, the case went cold. After the initial flurry of investigation in the late 1960s, the Marin County Jane Doe case lingered on the shelves of cold case detectives. The unknown woman was buried in an unmarked grave at Mount Tamalpais Cemetery in San Rafael, California, and for years her tombstone bore no name. All the while, Dorothy Vaillancourt's family was suffering, not knowing what became of her. Dorothy's 7 children had been separated from their mother in the mid-1960s. In fact, her family spent years actively searching for her, never imagining that the unidentified Jane Doe in Marin County was their missing mother. Dorothy's daughter, Penelope Vaillancourt, who was a teenager when her mother vanished, never gave up trying to find answers. She would ride buses through San Francisco, scanning the faces in the streets for a glimpse of her mother's familiar features. The family reached out to agencies like the FBI and local cold case units, and even checked cemeteries for unidentified graves, hoping for any clue to Dorothy's fate. At one point, Penelope even visited the Australian consulate in San Francisco, thinking her mother might have tried to return to her homeland. Her children suspected that Dorothy's disappearance might be tied to a man in her life, and without evidence of her death, they had little closure. The cold case of Marin County's Jane Doe finally saw progress in the 21st century thanks to forensic genealogy. In 2022, the California Department of Justice and the Marin County Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram to re-examine the evidence from the 1966 case. Othram was conducting a special program to tackle unsolved cases with no other leads, and the Marin case was a prime candidate. Using a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing, Othram's scientists were able to extract a comprehensive DNA profile from the decades-old remains. Once Othram had a DNA profile, their in-house forensic genealogists compared it against public genetic databases to find relatives. This painstaking family tree research eventually led to a break in late 2024. A set of genetic matches pointed to relatives of the unidentified woman. By reconstructing the family lineage, investigators homed in on a particular family with ties to Australia. In early 2025, Marin County Sheriff's officials contacted surviving family members of a long-lost woman and obtained DNA reference samples from them. These samples confirmed what the genealogy strongly suggested. The Marin County Jane Doe was Dorothy. The identification was formally announced on March 20th, 2025, ending the nearly 59-year mystery of the Jane Doe's name. Identifying the remains as Dorothy Vaillancourt also shed light on the life story behind the victim. She had been born Dorothy Jean Williams in 1917 in Hobart, Tasmania, an island state of Australia. She grew up in Tasmania and trained as a nurse, and during World War II, Dorothy was working at a Sydney hospital when she met a young American serviceman, François Vaillancourt. François, an American of French-Canadian descent who went by Frank, was a U.S. Marine who had served in the Pacific Theater. The couple married during the war, and after 1945, Dorothy left Australia to begin a new life with her husband in North America. They briefly stayed in François' hometown of Lowell, Massachusetts, then moved west to San Francisco, California, to settle down. In San Francisco, the Vaillancourts built a family, and François worked as a house painter, and Dorothy continued her nursing career in the city. They had 7 children together, and were initially a happy family. However, the good times weren't destined to last. The strain of raising a large family and personal issues took a toll on the marriage. The Vaillancourts eventually divorced in the early 1960s, and Dorothy struggled in the aftermath. She developed a serious alcohol problem and had difficulty holding down a job. Child welfare authorities became concerned about the children's care. Ultimately, the 7 kids were placed in group homes in the San Francisco area during the mid-1960s. Around this time, Dorothy became involved with a new man, one who would later factor into theories about her fate. She met a German immigrant named Hermann Julius Hess and remarried in June 1964. The pair bought a house in Fairfax, a town in Marin County north of San Francisco. At first it may have seemed like a fresh start for Dorothy, but her new German husband had a dark side. He claimed to have been a figure of authority in the Third Reich, a claim that appears to have likely been made up to instill fear in Dorothy. Whether this was true or not, what was definitely true is that Hess had a violent temper. Penelope and her siblings later described disturbing incidents. In one confrontation, Hess punched 14-year-old Penelope in the face. When her brother intervened, Hess violently attacked the brother and tried to strangle Penelope until the police were called. In the wake of that incident, Hess was arrested. However, the records of this incident now appear to be lost to time. After Hess's arrest, the children, who had briefly been reunited with their mother, were removed from the home in Fairfax. Some of the children went back to live with their father, Frank, but others were sent to orphanages or foster homes. Dorothy remained with Hess in Marin County after the children were gone. By late 1965, Dorothy and Hess were struggling financially. they were court-ordered to sell their Fairfax home to cover debts. The historical record becomes spotty after that, but it appears that at some point in 1966, Dorothy and Herman Hess separated or fell out of touch. Dorothy, battling alcoholism and having lost her stable home, essentially became transient. The last known sighting of her while alive was the encounter at the fire station in the fall of 1966. With Dorothy Vaillancourt's identity now established, the focus turns to how she died and what led to her body being left on that steep Tiburon slope. Unfortunately, this aspect of the case remains unsolved. Back in 1966, the coroner could not determine a cause of death due to the decomposition and lack of obvious injuries. All that could be said was that she likely died around October 1966, roughly 2 months before discovery, and that her death was not immediately attributable to any cause. Whether Dorothy's demise was the result of foul play, an accident, or some other misfortune is still unknown. The Marin County Sheriff's Office has not publicly stated whether they have reopened a criminal investigation now that Dorothy has been identified. As of the identification in 2025, officials simply acknowledged that the manner of her death is unclear and still under investigation. Several theories have emerged as to what happened to her. One theory points to Herman Hess, Dorothy's second husband, as a possible culprit. Given Hess's documented violence toward Dorothy and her children, some of Dorothy's surviving family members believe he may have had something to do with her death. Perhaps, they speculate, Hess and Dorothy met one last time in 1966, and an altercation occurred that resulted in Dorothy's death. Supporting this theory is Hess's behavior and the timing. Dorothy vanished not long after separating from him. However, Herman Hess himself is, with certainty, deceased, given that he was born in 1911. If Hess did harm Dorothy, he cannot be brought to justice now, but confirming his involvement would at least answer the family's lingering questions. Another theory is that Dorothy's death could have been a tragic accident or the result of exposure. It's possible that on the night she died, Dorothy was walking alone along the quiet road, perhaps under the influence. In her vulnerable state, she could have stumbled into danger. A hit-and-run incident is one potential scenario. A driver may have hit her and then, in a panic, tossed her body down the embankment to cover up what had happened. Alternatively, Dorothy might have simply lost her footing on the edge of the road and fallen down the slope, succumbing to injuries or exposure without anyone around to help. Another theory focuses on the somewhat odd actions of the firefighter who had seen her a few months prior to her discovery. This theory is entirely speculative, but as the last known person to have seen her alive, some have placed suspicion on him. It's unknown what investigative steps were taken with respect to him at the time Dorothy was discovered, and it's unknown whether he's still alive. Still another theory suggests that Dorothy may have intentionally went off the embankment in a successful effort to end it all. The evidence to support this is entirely circumstantial. However, Dorothy had essentially lost everything. Her family had been taken away from her, and her second marriage, albeit to an absolute monster, had just collapsed. Further, she was suffering from substance use issues, which may have compounded her existing problems. I hope to have an update on what happened to Dorothy in a future episode. Glenn and Bessie Hyde were an adventurous young couple whose honeymoon adventure in the Grand Canyon became the stuff of legends. Their journey was meant to put their names in the record books, but instead, it became a mystery with more twists and turns than the Colorado River itself. Glenn was born in Idaho in 1898 and grew up working on his family's farm. An experienced outdoorsman, he had previously built his own boats and navigated wild rivers, and in 1926 he ran the Salmon and Snake Rivers in Idaho. Bessie, born in West Virginia in 1905, had an artistic bohemian streak. She was a poet and had even tried her hand at theater and art. The two met as passengers on a ship traveling to Los Angeles in 1927 and felt an instant connection. At the time, Bessie was unhappily married to another man, but she obtained a quick divorce the following year. Just one day after her divorce was finalized, Bessie married Glenn on April 10th, 1928. For their honeymoon, Glenn proposed an ambitious journey. He would build a custom boat, and together, they would run the rapids of the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. If successful, Bessie would become the first woman ever documented to navigate the Grand Canyon in this way. But this intrepid duo wasn't planning on breaking just one barrier. They were planning on setting the record for the fastest navigation of the Grand Canyon by boat. Beyond the thrill of exploration, the couple saw this journey as a path to fame and fortune. They planned to write a book about their adventure and go on a lecture tour recounting their exploits. In the late 1920s, such daring exploits captured the public's imagination. Charles Lindbergh had recently flown across the Atlantic, and adventurers were celebrated as heroes. Glenn and Bessie hoped their river voyage would catapult them into that pantheon of explorers, and at ages 29 and 22 respectively, the newlyweds eagerly set out to make their mark. On October 20th, 1928, 6 months after their wedding, Glenn and Bessie launched their honeymoon adventure. In the town of Green River, Utah, Glenn had constructed a sturdy 20-foot wooden flat-bottomed boat suitable for heavy rapids. Local rivermen remarked that the homemade craft looked ominously like a coffin, and warned that few amateurs attempted the Colorado's rapids in such boats. Undeterred, the Hydes pushed off down the Green River, which feeds into the Colorado, aiming to reach Needles, California by early December. Only about 50 people had ever navigated the entire Grand Canyon by boat at that time, underscoring the audacity of their attempt. The first weeks of the voyage went relatively smoothly, especially given the difficulty of the voyage and the fact that Bessie was inexperienced in rapid river conditions. Glenn's river running experience and careful preparation paid off as they traversed Utah's Labyrinth and Cataract Canyons and entered Arizona. But the Colorado River in Grand Canyon was more formidable than anything Glenn had seen. In letters to his family, he described the rapids as longer and fiercer than those he'd encountered elsewhere. The journey was not without scares. At one point, Glenn was tossed out of the boat, and Bessie had to pull him back in, and another rapid nearly swept Bessie overboard. Still, by mid-November, the couple had traveled over 200 miles and reached Bright Angel Creek in Grand Canyon, achieving a remarkably fast run for the era. That said, they no longer had any meaningful chance of breaking any speedrunning records, which changed their plans slightly. On November 15th, 1928, with the most dangerous stretch of river still ahead, Glenn and Bessie decided to pause their river trek. They hiked up the Bright Angel Trail to Grand Canyon Village on the south rim to resupply and rest. During this brief layover, the Hydes drew attention. They were interviewed by a reporter from the Denver Post, and their bold trip was noted by tourists and locals at the canyon rim. The famed Grand Canyon photographer Emery Kolb welcomed them into his studio at the rim. Kolb had twice run the river himself and knew its perils well. He took a now famous photograph of the couple standing at the canyon's edge on November 17th, 1928. Observing them, Kolb noted that Bessie appeared worn out and apprehensive about continuing the journey. He also observed that Glenn was extremely exhausted, but determined, perhaps to the detriment of the couple. Emery Kolb urged the newlyweds to postpone the rest of the trip until spring, and even offered them additional safety gear, such as life jackets and inner tubes. Glenn refused all assistance, insisting he and Bessie were strong swimmers and determined to finish the trip without such help. According to Kolb, Glenn declared, quote, "I'm gonna do it without life jackets or else." A defiant statement that in hindsight sounds foreboding. It appears that they didn't take these basic safety precautions under the belief that it would make their story more sensationalistic after they had completed the trip. On November 16th, they met a wealthy adventurer, Gilbert Sutro, at Phantom Ranch and agreed to give him a short ride downriver. Sutro rode with Glenn and Bessie for a couple of days, and on November 18th, 1928, they dropped him off at a location called Hermit Camp. Gilbert Sutro would be the last person to ever see Glenn and Bessie, and the Hydes continued downstream into the canyon's isolation. Glenn and Bessie never arrived at their destination. They had expected to finish their voyage and meet family in Needles, California by early December. When the scheduled date passed with no word from the Hydes, concern rapidly grew. Alarmed by the overdue newlyweds, Glenn's father, a man named Rollin Hyde, launched a vigorous search effort almost immediately. In December 1928, Rollin traveled to Grand Canyon and organized multiple search parties. Experienced river runners, including Emery Kolb, the photographer from earlier, and his brother Ellsworth, joined the effort. Rollin also enlisted experienced Native American trackers to scour the canyon rims for any sign of the couple. Such was the concern that the U.S. Secretary of War was convinced to authorize an aerial search of the Grand Canyon, a dramatic measure in those days. On December 19, 1928, an Army aircraft scouting the canyon finally spotted something: the Hydes boat, adrift in the icy Colorado River. It was floating upright in a calm stretch of water near River Mile 237, not far from the end of the Grand Canyon at the Lower Granite Gorge. A few days later, on December 24th, Emery Kolb reached the abandoned boat and inspected it. Mysteriously, the vessel was in good shape. It hadn't been smashed up as one may expect in a fatal rapids accident. The boat was upright and undamaged, merely holding about a foot of water inside. Even more puzzling, all of the couple's supplies were still neatly stowed. Glenn and Bessie's personal belongings remained strapped in place. Their food provisions, cooking gear, and blankets, even their coats and hiking boots were still in the boat. Amongst the other significant items found aboard were Bessie's diary and the camera containing photographs of their trip. Nothing appeared amiss, except for the fact that Glenn and Bessie were nowhere to be found. Searchers combed the area for clues. They discovered footprints and a campsite believed to be the Hydes' last camp, around River Mile 225 or 226 near Diamond Creek. The diary recovered from the boat provided a tantalizing glimpse into the final days of the journey. Bessie's last entry was dated November 30th, 1928, nearly 2 weeks after the Hydes were last seen by Sutro. In that entry, Bessie noted that they had successfully cleared the rapid at the 231-mile mark and were likely ahead of schedule, having regained lost time. The fact that they had regained this time may have meant the couple was taking further unnecessary risks in an effort to make the story more media-worthy. This suggested they had survived many days beyond November 18th and navigated some of the canyon's hardest rapids. By all evidence, the Hydes had been making good progress and were within about 40 miles of their goal in early December. One possible clue came from a canyon prospector who reported seeing a brown leather jacket floating in the river around the time of the Hydes' disappearance. Bessie was known to wear a brown leather jacket, raising the grim possibility that she had been tossed into the water. That said, the jacket was never recovered, and that clue ended up amounting to nothing. Despite exhaustive searches by land, air, and water, no bodies or definitive traces of Glenn or Bessie were ever found. The official investigation eventually concluded without a clear resolution. No remains meant no way to say for certain what happened. Investigators presumed the couple had met with a tragic accident in the canyon. In the absence of other evidence, authorities believed that at some point in early December, the Hyde's boat struck hidden rocks in a rapid near mile 232. It's believed that this forceful strike ejected both Glenn and Bessie into the cold, swift river. Given that neither had worn life jackets, the strong currents could have quickly swept them under. On paper, the Hydes were declared dead by drowning, but the lack of concrete proof left the case frustratingly open-ended. The disappearance of Glenn and Bessie Hyde made headlines and captivated the public in 1928 and 1929. Here was a daring young couple who ventured into the wild for their honeymoon and simply vanished. Newspapers recounted their adventurous spirits and the enigma of their empty boat. At a time when Grand Canyon expeditions were front-page news, the Hyde's fate became one of the great unsolved mysteries of the American West. The story's elements, romance, adventure, and an unexplained vanishing, would continue to spark curiosity and conjecture for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath of the failed expedition, most people accepted the simple explanation that Glenn and Bessie Hyde had suffered a fatal mishap on the river. Park authorities noted the treacherous nature of the rapids at mile 232, which had a history of wrecking boats and was considered the likeliest point of disaster. However, the very mystery that made the Hyde story famous also invited speculation. With no bodies recovered and some puzzling aspects, like the boat being undamaged, alternative theories began to circulate in the years following 1928. Even early on, those close to the case pondered different scenarios. Emery Kolb, who had been among the last to speak with the couple, theorized that perhaps disaster struck while they were scouting a rapid on foot. River runners often walk along the shore to examine dangerous rapids before running them. Kolb speculated that one of the Hydes might have slipped into the water and the other jumped in to attempt a rescue, leading both to be swept away. Glenn's father, Rollin, had a different idea. He wondered if the couple might have encountered trouble with a rapid, decided to abandon the river, and tried to hike out of the canyon on foot. In Rollin's scenario, Glenn and Bessie could have gotten lost in the wilderness and died of exhaustion and exposure in a remote area. However, search teams never found footprints or tracks leading away from the river, which some believe makes this unlikely. Rumors also took hold, and with Emery Kolb playing such a prominent role in finding the boat, some whispers cast suspicion on him. These unfounded suspicions gained little traction until many years later, when a grisly discovery on Kolb's property would revive such talk. But I'll come back to that in a moment. Others looked to the Hydes themselves for answers. One dark theory suggested that perhaps Glenn, described by friends as determined and occasionally stubborn, might have lost his temper and harmed Bessie during an argument. Conversely, some speculated Bessie might have grown desperate to escape the perilous journey and slain Glenn. Both of these ideas led down the rabbit hole of theories that either one of them may have escaped and lived out the rest of their life under a new identity. Decades passed, yet the story of the Hydes refused to fade away. In 1971, 43 years after the disappearance, a startling claim made headlines and briefly suggested a very different ending to the tale. That year, an elderly woman named Elizabeth Cutler joined a commercial rafting trip down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. As the group swapped stories around a campfire near Diamond Creek, the quiet older woman calmly announced to her fellow rafters, "I'm Bessie Hyde." She told a brutal story of how she allegedly had to slay her husband in self-defense. After capturing headlines and attention, the authorities investigated her, and she was determined to have fabricated the entire thing. She was a retired psychology professor who, and I'm not joking here, said she made the false claim as a social experiment. Yeah, you heard me correctly. Elizabeth Cutler dropped, "It's just a prank, bro," as her defense in 1971. Truly, she was decades ahead of her time. But then things got even weirder. And trust me, this won't be the last time I drop that line. Another twist came to light in 1992 with the death of legendary river guide Georgie Clark. Georgie was a pioneering woman in the Grand Canyon rafting community, famous for her own river exploits. After she passed away, friends sorting through her belongings found some curious items, including the marriage certificate of Glenn and Bessie Hyde. Further, they found a birth certificate for a woman named Bessie DeRoss. These discoveries led to rampant speculation that Georgie Clark had actually been Bessie Hyde living under a new name. The coincidence of the name Bessie, the possession of the Hyde's documents, and Georgie's secretive nature fueled this theory in the public imagination. However, historians quickly noted that Georgie Clark's early life was well documented and did not match Bessie's biography. No credible evidence ever tied Georgie to the Hyde case beyond those curious artifacts, but some people still theorize the two may have been one and the same. But then things got even weirder, yet again. Meanwhile, a more concrete discovery had been made years earlier that cast suspicion back on Emery Kolb. In 1976, Emery Kolb died at the age of 95, having lived at the Grand Canyon for decades after the Hydes vanished. In 1977, as Kolb's historic studio was being sorted and cleaned, workers made a gruesome find in a boathouse on the property, a skeleton stuffed inside an old wooden box. The remains appeared to be that of a young adult male. The unknown skeleton's height and build roughly matched Glenn Hyde, and chillingly, a bullet was found lodged in the skull. This discovery spurred sensational rumors that Kolb, one of the last to see the Hydes alive, might have slain Glenn and hidden his body for nearly 50 years. Some theorized that Emery had slain Glenn after having become infatuated with Bessie. What happened to Bessie in this version of events varied, but in the end, it wouldn't matter due to a forensic break in 2008. Finally, in 2008, modern forensic efforts solved the riddle of the skeleton and cleared Emery Kolb's name. The skeleton was eventually linked to an individual who voluntarily departed the world in 1933. But it begged the question, why a photographer and river runner was keeping human remains. A dig through the historical archives eventually produced what many view as a satisfactory answer. Emery Kolb had served a variety of official roles in the region, and around 1933 he had served as a representative of the local coroner. It's suspected that Emery collected the skeleton and then improperly stored it. Nearly a century has passed since Glenn and Bessie Hyde set off down the Colorado River, chasing adventure and a place in the record books. What was meant to be the journey of a lifetime instead became a dark, unsolved chapter in wilderness lore. On the night of September 11, 2005, traffic at a busy intersection in Stanton, California, was disrupted by a sudden tragedy. A young woman dashed across the street against a red light and was struck by a car at around 9 p.m. near the corner of Beach Boulevard and Orangewood Avenue. The impact was severe, and paramedics rushed the gravely injured pedestrian to West Anaheim Medical Center, where despite their efforts, she was pronounced dead shortly afterward. She carried no identification, and in the aftermath of the accident, this woman remained entirely unknown. Authorities would come to refer to her only as the Stanton Jane Doe, the nameless victim of a fatal accident who left behind many clues but no clear identity. Investigators at the scene noted that the young woman appeared to be in her late teens or 20s. Her face was intact and recognizable despite the trauma, giving hope that someone might identify her. Yet no witnesses or personal documents could tell responders who she was. As police began their work, the immediate priority, beyond tending to the accident, became unraveling the mystery of this Jane Doe's identity. Who was this woman, and why had no one come forward to claim her? The official investigation kicked off that very night in 2005, setting in motion a case that remains unsolved to this day. From the outset, detectives gathered every available clue from the young woman's person and the accident scene. Forensic examiners documented her physical characteristics in detail. She was around 5 feet 3 inches tall and 165 pounds, with long, wavy black or brown hair and brown eyes. Perhaps the most telling clues were the clothing and personal belongings found with the Stanton Jane Doe. She was fully dressed in casual attire, suggesting she had been out and about that day. Notably, she wore a black tank top emblazoned with the words, "Baby Girl," in sequins, along with a white striped shirt over it. Over her outfit, she carried a distinctive jacket bearing the word New York on the front and NY Black Yankees on one sleeve. On her wrists, she wore several silver bangle bracelets. All of these items were carefully collected by the coroner. Inside the small black purse she had been carrying, investigators found more intriguing evidence. Tucked in her purse was a one-day bus pass for Orange County Bus Route 38, dated September 11, 2005, the very day of the accident. The bus pass appeared to have been purchased in the city of Norwalk, in Los Angeles County. There were also several shopping receipts from stores at the Buena Park Mall, a nearby shopping center, all time-stamped on the afternoon of September 11, 2005. In fact, records show she made purchases that day. One receipt from a shoe store around 5:30 for $70, and another from a clothing store around 6 p.m. for a jacket. Finally, in her purse was a damaged CD containing a compilation of reggaeton songs from 2005. Investigators noted that this is a musical genre with roots in Puerto Rico and Latin America, possibly another hint toward her cultural background. Each of these belongings, the bus ticket, the receipts, the CD, painted a partial picture of the Jane Doe's final day. She had likely spent the afternoon shopping and then taken a bus that evening, ending up on foot in Stanton. But none of these clues, as useful as they were for tracing her steps, immediately answered the core question: her name. Forensic evidence was also collected in hopes of a future identification. The coroner took the woman's fingerprints and DNA samples and preserved her dental records. Her fingerprints were run through law enforcement databases, but yielded no match to any known missing person or criminal record. DNA was uploaded to national unidentified persons databases, likewise with no immediate result. A dental examination suggested she was in her early 20s, with one forensic dentist estimating an age range of roughly 21 to 26 years based on her teeth. All this data was entered into official databases like Name Us, in the hope that eventually a match would emerge. Despite these efforts, in the initial investigation in 2005, no leads to her identity surfaced. It seemed she had not been reported missing at the time, and nothing about her fingerprints or DNA had a prior record on file. The case grew cold, and the Stanton Jane Doe was laid to rest in a county cemetery, her headstone lacking her name. Although the trail was initially cold, authorities did not close the book on the Stanton Jane Doe. Over the years, the Orange County Sheriff's Department and Coroner's Office periodically revisited the case, hoping new techniques or information might provide a breakthrough. They compared her profile against countless missing persons reports from California and across the country. By 2013, 8 years after the accident, investigators had formally ruled out almost 150 different missing women as being this Jane Doe. In October of the same year, as the 8th anniversary of the incident passed, Orange County officials made a renewed public push to identify the unknown woman. They released a forensic sketch of her face to the media, hoping it might jog someone's memory. The sketch depicted a youthful woman with curly hair and a gentle expression, based on morgue photographs and the coroner's observations. In parallel with the official investigation, the Stanton Jane Doe case has drawn the attention of amateur sleuths and true crime followers on the internet. Over the years, various public theories and speculation have emerged as people try to piece together who this young woman might have been. One popular line of reasoning is that the woman may have been a visitor from out of the area, possibly from the East Coast or Caribbean. Enthusiasts point to the NY Black Yankees jacket and the reggaeton music CD as cultural clues. Some have speculated that she could have been of either Puerto Rican or Dominican descent. This is based on the combination of her physical appearance, New York branded clothing, and Latin music. If she was from out of town, some have speculated that she may have been staying in a local hotel. If this theory were true, perhaps no family reported her missing, because her relatives were in another state or even country, completely unaware of the tragedy. Additionally, some have noted that jaywalking across a wide California boulevard, as she did, might be something a person from out of state would misjudge. People familiar with both Los Angeles and NYC have speculated that a local Angelino likely would have known not to jaywalk at the time and place she did. And, full disclosure here, I ended up going down a bit of a rabbit hole on the jaywalking culture in both cities. In NYC, where I've been and personally jaywalked on numerous occasions, I've seen people pull stunts in traffic which I considered extremely risky, like it was absolutely nothing to them. For any fans of Seinfeld out there, I'm reminded of the scene where George tries to jaywalk a Frogger machine across the street, with disastrous results. I'm much less personally familiar with LA, but according to my research, fast vehicles and very wide streets make it genuinely dangerous to jaywalk. Further, the LAPD had historically been very harsh in imposing stiff financial penalties associated with jaywalking, unlike in NYC, where the cops are very lax about it. Others have speculated that she was a local or recent transplant to the area who may have been estranged from her family. Some have speculated that given the limited amount of belongings carried on her, that this speaks to her being a local resident. Personally, I think this could just as easily support the theory that she left her ID in her hotel or motel while she went out. Others have speculated that she wasn't reported missing because she was living a transient lifestyle. This theory doesn't suggest she was living on the streets, but rather that she may have been bouncing around between homes of friends and acquaintances. As such, her disappearance may not have been noted in any meaningful way, and whoever she was staying with may have just thought she had moved on. Ultimately, at this point, I think this is a case that most likely gets resolved through genetic genealogy. It's unclear to me if the authorities have submitted her DNA to Othram or a similar company for testing, though I suspect they haven't. And the reason I say they likely haven't is that genetic genealogy is new, expensive, and time-consuming. There's no unsolved crime or potential perpetrator associated with solving her case, so I suspect that given limited investigative resources, we won't see a resolution for a few years. Rico Harris was a 37-year-old former basketball prospect who once played for the Harlem Globetrotters. He disappeared in October 2014 during a solo drive from his mother's home in Southern California en route to Seattle. A few days after he left, Harris's black Nissan Maxima was found abandoned at a park in rural Yolo County, north of Sacramento, with no sign of Harris himself. Despite an intensive search of the surrounding wilderness by authorities, not a single trace of the 6'9", 300-pound athlete was found. Rico grew up in Los Angeles County and showed early promise as a basketball player. In his late teens, he blossomed into a high school standout, becoming one of the nation's top 100 recruits courted by elite college programs like Connecticut, Kentucky, and UCLA. Unfortunately, Harris's path through college was tumultuous. He first enrolled at Arizona State University, but left after a freshman year arrest and academic issues. Harris then dominated at Los Angeles City College, leading the team to a state junior college championship in 1997. However, an attempt to transfer to a Division I program fell through due to a poor academic record. He finished his college career at Cal State Northridge, but his time there was marked by suspensions and conflicts with his coach. By 1999, perhaps unsurprisingly, the once promising player went undrafted in the NBA. Harris continued to pursue professional basketball on the fringe. In 2000, Rico joined the world-famous Harlem Globetrotters in hopes that this would raise his profile and he could move to a more legitimate basketball team. For those who aren't aware, the Globetrotters are a sports entertainment team rather than a competitive basketball team. His tenure with the Globetrotters lasted only a couple of months. He later said he left due to a combination of a nagging back injury and a serious concussion from being hit in the head with a baseball bat while trying to break up a fight. With that, Harris's basketball ambitions were effectively cut short, aside from a few attempts to play in a short-lived semi-pro league called the International Basketball League. Life after basketball proved challenging, and Harris fell into substance abuse, with alcohol being his most major issue. He would struggle off and on, but by 2007 he committed to sobriety and pieced his life back together, finding steady work in private security in Los Angeles. In 2012, while working as a security manager at a nightclub, Harris met Jennifer Song, an insurance broker from Seattle who was visiting California. The two began a long-distance relationship. For over 2 years, they maintained their bond through phone calls, text messages, and weekend visits. By 2014, Harris was looking toward the future with newfound optimism. He was nearing 7 years of sobriety and decided to relocate to Seattle to live with Jennifer permanently. He gradually moved his belongings into her Seattle townhouse and also secured a promising job interview in the area. This transition was not without difficulty, and Harris initially felt homesick and under pressure, and in late July 2014, he briefly relapsed into his old drinking habits. By early October 2014, Harris was still committed to his move and his new life in Seattle, or at least that's what he wanted people to believe outwardly. In the first week of October 2014, Rico Harris decided to make an impromptu trip from Seattle down to Alhambra in California to visit his family before fully settling in Seattle. According to Jennifer, he felt he needed to talk with his mother and brother, possibly to find closure with some past issues and to reassure his family about his new path. On October 8, 2014, Harris told Jennifer he was going out to explore Seattle while she went to the gym. Instead, he secretly began the 1,000-mile drive south to see his family. He drove through the night and arrived at his mother Margaret Fernandez's home in Alhambra around 2 o'clock in the morning on October 9th. Margaret was surprised and concerned by her son's sudden visit, and she later said she suspected he had been drinking when he showed up. Shortly after midnight, in the early hours of October 10th, 2014, Rico Harris quietly slipped out of his mother's house and began the long drive back to Seattle. At about 1 a.m., he phoned his mother, who hadn't even realized he had left. He then called Jennifer to let her know he was already on the road north. Jennifer was startled that he had left without sleeping, and the two spoke by phone for approximately 3 to 4 hours as Harris drove through Central California. Jennifer later said she grew increasingly concerned during that call, and his speech and thoughts were giving her cause for worry. Eventually, sometime before dawn, Jennifer fell asleep while on the phone with him. Around 8 o'clock in the morning on October 10th, Jennifer awoke and called Harris back, and he reported that he was near Sacramento. Not long after, at 10:45 that same morning, Harris left a voicemail for Jennifer saying that he was, quote, going up into the mountains to rest for a while, before continuing the drive. He mentioned that he hadn't slept much and needed to pull over. Approximately 30 minutes later, around 11:15 a.m., his cell phone was switched off, but whether Harris turned it off or the battery died is not clear. This was the last anyone ever heard from him, though panic didn't immediately set in. By October 13th, however, Harris had missed his important job interview in Seattle and still hadn't contacted anyone. That same day, far to the north in Yolo County, California, a sheriff's deputy was making a routine patrol through a secluded rest area known as Cache Creek Regional Park. The deputy noticed a black Nissan Maxima parked off to the side of the lot. It had been there the day before as well, which struck him as odd. On October 13th, after seeing the car again untouched, the deputy ran the license plates and discovered it was registered to Rico Harris. He contacted the Alhambra Police Department in Los Angeles County to inquire about the owner. Alhambra Police, in turn, went to Margaret Fernandez's house that day to inform her that Rico's car had been found abandoned hundreds of miles away in Northern California. Margaret immediately realized something was very wrong and filed a missing person report for her son on October 13th, 2014, officially launching the investigation into his disappearance. In the days following the car's discovery, a few tantalizing clues emerged. Investigators learned that Harris had stopped for gas in Lodi, California, around 100 miles south of where his car was found, and then apparently deviated from the main interstate. Why he drove into the isolated Cache Creek area remains uncertain. He may have taken a wrong turn or intentionally driven into the hills to rest or sightsee. Several witnesses later reported seeing a large African-American man fitting Harris's description in the vicinity on October 11th and 12th. One passerby recalled a tall man walking along Route 16 in the early morning hours of October 11th. Another motorist believed he saw the same man sitting on a guardrail overlooking Cache Creek around that time. Additionally, a couple reported seeing a giant man wandering around a black car on October 12th, appearing disoriented. These sightings suggested that Harris was indeed alive and on foot in the area for at least a day or two after he left the highway. Search teams discovered very large shoe prints by the creek near the parking lot, including one set of fresh impressions that matched the size 18 sneakers Harris wore. They noted that the prints went down toward the water and then back up, as if someone had walked to the creek and returned. In the same vicinity, investigators found an insert from a shoe believed to be from Harris's footwear based upon the size alone. This indicated that Harris had likely been the person who parked the car there and had walked around the area. About 1,500 feet up the road from the parking lot, searchers also recovered Harris's black backpack, abandoned on the roadside. Inside it were jumper cables, some clothing, and 2 plastic bottles, one empty and one partially filled with hard liquor. Crucially, the backpack also contained Harris's cell phone and charger. On October 18th, another sighting of Rico was reported, and the authorities found fresh footprints, again from size 18 shoes. Yet despite these leads, searchers couldn't locate Harris. Sniffer dogs were brought in and signaled interest in a particular spot along the creek, prompting dive teams to search pools of water, but no evidence was found. In the absence of concrete answers, several theories have been put forward to explain what might have happened to Rico Harris. The lead detective on the case eventually came to believe that no foul play was involved, and that Harris may have voluntarily walked away from his life. The investigation found no evidence of struggle or violence at the scene. The car, the phone, and the backpack all appeared to have been left undisturbed by anyone other than Harris himself. The lead detective theorized that Harris might have taken a wrong turn off the highway, and upon finding the serene Cache Creek area, decided to stop and rest. It was noted that he had been under significant pressure. He was moving to a new city, potentially starting a new job, and struggling to maintain sobriety. Further, he was in the process of adjusting to living with his girlfriend. The authorities officially speculated that the weight of those unresolved personal issues and life changes may have led to Harris not returning to Seattle. Interestingly, the lead detective has gone on record saying that he believes that sometime after Rico's car was towed, Rico may have gotten a ride out of the area. A related theory has focused on Harris's psychological state. By all accounts, he was under severe stress. Lack of sleep, the cross-country move, and his recent relapse might have created a perfect storm. It's possible Harris experienced a mental health crisis or emotional breakdown in the hours leading up to his disappearance. If Harris became disoriented or suffered some kind of break, he might have intentionally walked away into a new life or inadvertently placed himself in danger. Some believe that he may have entered into a dissociative fugue and started a new life, either being unaware of his old identity or simply preferring his new life. That said, others have observed that his physical appearance would likely make it harder for him to start fresh, since he literally stands head and shoulders above everyone else. Another possibility is that Rico Harris intended to return to his journey after resting, but fell victim to an accident in the remote wilderness. Harris may have been exhausted and possibly dehydrated, and as suggested by the bottles in his backpack, he had relapsed once again. It's conceivable that while walking around in a fatigued state, he could have slipped and injured himself or gotten lost in the wild. A fall down a ravine or into the fast-moving creek could prove fatal. If he succumbed to exposure or injury, his remains might have been missed in the initial search, especially if they ended up in a concealed spot or were moved by natural elements. From the start, investigators didn't see obvious signs of foul play in Harris's case. There was no blood and no indication of a struggle at the car. Further yet, Harris was, to put it mildly, not an easy target, standing 6'9" and with a powerful build. That said, his friends and family knew him to be a mild-mannered individual who got along with everyone, and suspect that he may have let his guard down around the wrong people.